The envelope was not merely mail, it was a subpoena to a public execution. Heavy, cream-colored and cloyingly scented with Eleanor Sterling's signature lavender, a smell that still triggered a phantom ache in Peyton's chest. It arrived on a silver tray. Inside, gold calligraphy shimmered with a cruelty that felt physical. The honor of your presence is requested at the marriage of Mr. Dominic Sterling and Miss Vanessa Banks. A handwritten note at the bottom, penned in Eleanor's sharp, spidery script, added the final twist. We thought you'd appreciate a hot meal and a chance to see what a real Sterling wedding looks like. Dress code is black tie. Do try to find something that doesn't smell of grease. Peyton O'Connor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, the Seattle rain drumming a rhythmic, melancholic beat against the glass. In her hand, the invitation felt like a piece of radioactive lead. She looked down at the gold ink, and for a moment the sleek, modern lines of her office blurred into the cold marble hallways of the Sterling estate in the Hamptons. She could almost feel the weight of the vintage silver pocket watch she carried in her silk robe pocket, the only thing she had taken from Dominic when she left. It was a 1920s Patek Philippe that had belonged to Dominic's father, the only man in that family who had ever looked at Peyton with anything resembling kindness. Its ticking was steady, a heartbeat of a legacy that Eleanor Sterling thought she had successfully severed. "Mommy, why is your face sad?" The voice, small and clear, shattered the ghost of the Hamptons. Peyton looked down. Leo was tugging at the hem of her cashmere trousers, his brow furrowed in that specific brooding way that used to make her heart skip a beat when she saw it on Dominic. Behind him, on the plush Moroccan rug, Sam and Max were locked in a silent, intense battle over a set of architectural blocks. 3 boys, 3 identical sets of piercing, ice-blue eyes, 3 heirs to a name they didn't even know they possessed. "It's nothing, Leo," Peyton said, her voice softening as she knelt to his level. She tucked the invitation into the pocket of her robe, shielding him from the toxicity of the Sterling name. "Just some old news. Why don't you go help Max build the bridge?" As Leo scampered off, Peyton's assistant, Chloe, a woman whose sharp mind was matched only by her loyalty, stepped into the room. She held a tablet, her face a mask of professional neutrality that Peyton knew masked a simmering rage. "The PR team just flagged the announcement, Peyton. The Banks-Sterling merger is being framed as the union of the century in the Times. Eleanor is positioning Vanessa as the savior of the Sterling reputation." Chloe paused, her eyes falling on the cream-colored envelope peeking out of Peyton's pocket. "She actually sent it, didn't she?" "She wants a witness, Chloe," Peyton said, walking back to her mahogany desk. She sat down, the leather creaking under her. "Eleanor doesn't just want to win. She wants to watch the person she thinks she defeated crawl back into the room so she can step on them one last time. She thinks I'm still that 22-year-old waitress who walked out of that house with a rusted suitcase and a broken heart." Peyton looked around her office. O'Connor and Associates was now the premier branding agency on the West Coast. She had built an empire out of the ashes of her dignity. She had worked 18-hour days with newborns strapped to her chest in a one-bedroom apartment, fueled by caffeine and the sheer stubborn refusal to let Eleanor Sterling be right about her. "She thinks you're destitute," Chloe whispered. "The private investigators she hired years ago only found the trail you wanted them to find, the one that ended at a shelter in Portland." "Let her keep thinking it," Peyton replied. She pulled the silver pocket watch from her pocket and clicked it open. The internal gears whirred, precise and unstoppable. "Dominic signed those divorce papers without even looking at me. He let his mother throw a settlement check at my feet like I was a maid she was dismissing for breaking a vase. He doesn't deserve to know these boys." "But you're thinking about going," Chloe noted, her voice hushed. Peyton looked at her sons. They were 4 years old now, sturdy, brilliant and kind. They were everything a Sterling was supposed to be, without any of the rot. Eleanor wants a show, Peyton said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. She wants to humiliate the peasant who dared to marry into her bloodline. She wants to show the world that the Sterlings are back on top. Peyton stood up, her silhouette sharp against the Seattle skyline. The transformation from the weeping girl of the past to the titan of the present was complete, but the world didn't know it yet. The Hamptons thought they were preparing for a wedding. They didn't realize they were preparing for an excavation. "Clear my schedule for next weekend," Peyton commanded. Her eyes were no longer sad. They were as cold and focused as the Pacific. "Call the atelier in Paris. I don't want a dress, Chloe. I want a declaration of war, and call the tailor for the boys. If we're going to a family reunion, it's only fair that the grandmother meets the legacy she tried to throw away." She reached out and picked up the invitation, her thumb brushing over the gold ink. With a deliberate, slow motion, she didn't tear it. She tucked it into her leather folio. "Dominic thinks he's starting a new life," she whispered to the empty room. "But he's about to find out that the past doesn't just stay buried. Sometimes it grows up and comes back to claim everything." The ticking of the silver watch seemed to grow louder in the silence, a countdown to a collision that the Sterling family would never see coming. Peyton picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't touched in years. "Uncle Alistair," she said when the line connected. "It's Peyton. I think it's time you took a trip to the Hamptons. There's a genetic miracle I think you'd be very interested in seeing." The emotional turning point had been reached. There was no going back. The waitress was gone. The CEO had arrived, and she was bringing the truth with her. The Sterling estate did not welcome. It intimidated. Perched on the jagged cliffs of the Hamptons, the sprawling limestone manor looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the unworthy at bay. As the sun began to dip toward the Atlantic, casting long bruised shadows across the manicured lawns, Eleanor Sterling stood on the terrace, her eyes like polished obsidian. In her hand was a crystal glass of Sancerre, chilled to the exact degree of her soul. She watched the caterers and florists scurrying below like ants, erecting a massive white silk tent that would soon host the union of the century. Thousands of white orchids, flown in from Singapore, were being woven into arches that smelled of rain and money. "Dominic, stand up straight. You're slouching like a commoner." Inside the library, Dominic Sterling flinched. He was standing by the mahogany desk, a tuxedo jacket draped over a chair, looking every bit the Prince Eleanor had sculpted him to be. Yet there was a sallowness to his skin that no amount of expensive tanning could hide. He was 32, but in the presence of his mother, he felt like a boy of 10 waiting for the switch. "I'm tired, Mother," Dominic muttered, swirling a glass of neat scotch. "The merger meetings with Senator Banks have been grueling. Vanessa wants to change the seating chart again." "Vanessa is a Banks," Eleanor snapped, her heels clicking sharply as she entered the room. "She brings a seat on the Senate Finance Committee and a lineage that dates back to the Mayflower. She is the correction to your previous lapse in judgment." Dominic's hand tightened around his glass. "Peyton wasn't a lapse in judgment. She was my wife." "She was a distraction," Eleanor corrected, her voice dropping to a silken, dangerous register. "A waitress with a pretty face and a desperate ambition to social climb. You let her in, and she nearly bled us dry with that pathetic settlement. We gave her nothing, Mother. You ensured that." Dominic looked out the window, his eyes vacant. "I didn't even look her in the eye when I signed. I didn't even ask where she was going." Eleanor smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Precisely, and to ensure she understands the finality of her failure, I've sent her an invitation. I want her to see you at the altar with a woman who actually belongs there. I want her to sit at the back, near the service entrance, and realize that she was nothing more than a footnote in the Sterling legacy." Dominic froze. "You invited her here? That's cruel, even for you." "It's closure," Eleanor replied, walking to the desk. She picked up Dominic's phone, which had been buzzing with notifications. She scrolled through it with the casual intrusion of someone who believed she owned the air her son breathed. She hasn't RSVP'd. Perhaps she needs a little encouragement. Mother, don't. But Eleanor was already typing, her fingers adorned with a 10-carat emerald that had once belonged to a Russian duchess, moved with clinical precision. Hope you received the invite. Mother insisted. We thought you could use a free meal. Dress code is black tie, but try to do your best. Dominic. She hit send and tossed the phone back onto the desk like it was a piece of trash. There. Now she knows it comes from you. She'll come. Women like her can never resist the chance to breathe the air of the elite one last time, even if it's to suffer. Dominic stared at the screen, the blue bubble of the sent text feeling like a stain. He felt a phantom weight in his pocket, or rather, the lack of it. I still can't find my father's pocket watch, the Patek. I've looked everywhere. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. Peyton likely stole it, probably sold it to pay for some dingy apartment in whatever slum she's rotting in. It's gone, Dominic, just like she is. Stop looking for relics and start looking at your future. The mistake was now etched in digital ink. Eleanor's arrogance was her blind spot. She believed she knew exactly who Peyton O'Connor was. She saw a girl in a stained apron, a girl who could be bought, bullied, and broken. She didn't see the woman in the glass-walled penthouse 3,000 miles away. She didn't see the CEO who could buy the sterling debt with the change in her handbag. And what if she doesn't come alone? Dominic asked, a strange, unbidden anxiety prickling his skin. Eleanor laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Who would she bring? A line cook? A debt collector? Let her bring whoever she likes. The more witnesses to her humiliation, the better. Meanwhile, a mile down the road at the local airstrip, a private Gulfstream G650 touched down. It was sleek, black, and bore no markings except for a small, stylized O on the tail. Inside the terminal, Uncle Alistair, the Sterling family's black sheep, and a man who had spent 40 years decoding the secrets of the human genome, waited by the baggage claim. He had received a package from Seattle 2 days prior. Inside was a lock of hair from 3 different children, and a note that simply said, "Check the markers, Alistair. Look for the gold fleck." He had run the tests in his private lab. The results had made his hands shake. "They're coming, aren't they?" Alistair whispered to himself, looking toward the sprawling Sterling estate on the hill. "The ghosts are coming home." The mistake wasn't just the invitation. The mistake was the assumption that the Sterlings were the only ones who knew how to play the game. Eleanor had spent years teaching Peyton that legacy was everything. She was about to find out that Peyton had learned the lesson far too well. Back at the manor, the caterers began to unload crates of vintage Bollinger. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and salt, a beautiful gilded shroud over a family that was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Dominic picked up his phone and stared at the text again. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to delete it, to call her, to apologize. But Eleanor was watching him, her hand on his shoulder, her grip like iron under a velvet glove. "Smile, Dominic," she whispered. "The world is watching, and we never let them see the cracks." The chapter ends on the image of the massive white tent flapping in the ocean breeze, a beautiful temporary structure built on sand, much like the Sterling fortune itself. The Saturday of the wedding dawned with a clarity that felt almost biblical. The Atlantic was a sheet of hammered silver, and the air in the Hamptons was thick with the scent of salt and the thousands of white roses Eleanor had ordered to mask the smell of decay. At the Sterling estate, the machinery of high society was in full swing. Bentleys and Rolls-Royces crawled up the gravel driveway like a procession of shiny beetles, carrying the architects of the country's economy and the gatekeepers of its social registries. Eleanor Sterling was a vision in champagne lace, her face a masterpiece of surgical precision and expensive creams. She moved through the pre-ceremony cocktail hour on the terrace, a predator in a tea dress, accepting compliments with a smile that never reached her eyes. "She's late," Eleanor whispered to Dominic as he approached her. He looked stiff in his Tom Ford tuxedo, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of sparkling water. "Your little waitress. I was hoping she'd arrive early so the help could show her where the servants' entrance is." "Maybe she's not coming, Mother," Dominic said, his voice hollow. He kept touching his waistcoat, his fingers searching for the weight of the missing Patek Philippe watch. It was a phantom limb, a missing piece of himself he couldn't quite name. "Maybe we should just let it go." "Nonsense," Eleanor hissed. "Humiliation is only effective if there is a witness." "Ah, look, security is having a bit of a disagreement at the gate." A mile down the road, a convoy of 3 blacked-out Cadillac Escalades sat idling at the main security checkpoint. The guard, a young man with a clipboard and a sweating brow, peered into the driver's side window of the lead vehicle. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard stammered, checking his list for the 10th time. "I have a Peyton O'Connor listed for parking lot B, shuttle service access only. These vehicles are in the bridal party lane. You'll need to turn around." The back window of the lead Escalade slid down with a silent, motorized hiss. Peyton didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She leaned forward, the sunlight catching the emerald-cut diamonds at her ears. She was wearing a custom Versace gown in a shade of deep forest green that made her look like a force of nature, a weapon made of silk, as she had promised Chloe. "Open the gate," Peyton said. It wasn't a request. It was an order issued with the terrifying confidence of someone who owned the company that insured the guard's house. She lowered her designer sunglasses, her gaze pinning the man to the spot. "My name is Peyton O'Connor. I am the CEO of O'Connor and Associates. I am not here for the shuttle. I am here for the reckoning." The guard, overwhelmed by the sheer aura of authority radiating from the car, didn't even check his clipboard again. He hit the button and the heavy iron gate swung open. On the terrace, the murmur of the crowd died down as the 3 black SUVs rolled up the driveway. They didn't park in the lot. They came to a halt directly in front of the main garden entrance, a spot reserved for the senator and the groom's immediate family. The wedding planner, a frantic woman with a headset, ran toward the cars. "You can't park here. This is for—" The driver of the first car stepped out, a man built like a brick wall in a tailored suit, and opened the rear door. First, a pair of emerald silk heels hit the gravel. Then, Peyton stepped out, smoothing the lines of her gown. She stood to her full height, her chin tilted up, her hair swept into a modern architectural bun. She looked like a movie star, or perhaps a queen returning from exile. The crowd on the terrace leaned over the railing, a ripple of "Who is that?" moving through the elite like a physical wave. Dominic's glass shattered on the stone floor. He didn't even notice. He was staring at the woman he had discarded 4 years ago, unable to reconcile the broken girl in the floral dress with the titan standing on his lawn. "Peyton?" he whispered, the name a bruise on his lips. But the real shock came a second later. Peyton turned back to the car and held out her hand. "Come on, boys. Stay close to Mommy." One by one, they hopped out. Leo, Sam, and Max. The silence that fell over the Sterling estate was absolute. It was the silence of a heart stopping. The triplets were dressed in matching miniature velvet tuxedos, midnight blue for Leo, burgundy for Sam, and forest green for Max. They were beautiful, healthy, and vibrant, and they were undeniably, hauntingly Sterlings. They had Dominic's dark, wavy hair. They had the signature Sterling set of the jaw, and as they looked up at the terrace, squinting in the afternoon sun, 3 pairs of piercing ice-blue eyes scanned the crowd. "Mommy," Max said, his voice carrying in the unnatural quiet. "Is this the big house with the mean lady?" Eleanor Sterling gripped the stone railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Her face, usually so composed, was a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at the boys, then at Peyton, then back at the boys. The math of the timeline hit her like a physical blow. 4 years, 3 heirs. Peyton adjusted Leo's bow tie with a calm, practiced hand. She looked up toward the terrace, her eyes locking onto Eleanor's. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply stood there, flanked by the 3 most powerful pieces on the board. Children Eleanor had never known existed, children who held the legal and genetic keys to the Sterling Kingdom. Peyton reached into her clutch and pulled out the silver Patek Philippe pocket watch. She clicked it open, the sound of the gears ticking like a countdown. She checked the time, then looked at Dominic, who was frozen at the top of the stairs. "You're late for your wedding, Dominic," Peyton called out, her voice clear and melodic, carrying effortlessly to every guest in the garden. "But don't worry, I've brought the family you forgot you had to help you celebrate." The reveal was complete. The union of the century had just become the scandal of the decade, and the first note of the wedding march hadn't even been played. As Peyton began to walk toward the seating area, the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She didn't head for the back. She walked straight to the front row, to the seats reserved for the Sterling family, and sat down. "This is going to be a very long afternoon," she whispered to herself, as the first guest's phone went up to record the ruin. "What is the meaning of this?" Eleanor hissed, her voice a low, vibrating tremor. She loomed over Peyton, trying to use her height and her history of dominance as a shroud. "How dare you turn my son's wedding into a circus? I invited you to sit in the back and learn your place, not to parade these actors in front of my guests." Peyton didn't even uncross her legs. She smoothed the lapel of Sam's burgundy velvet jacket, her movements fluid and agonizingly slow. She finally looked up, her emerald eyes reflecting the sunlight with a cold, hard brilliance. "Hello, Eleanor," Peyton said, her voice smooth as velvet but sharp as a razor. "You look tight. Is that a new surgeon, or just the weight of the lies finally catching up to you?" Eleanor's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Get out now. Take these children and leave before I have security drag you out in front of the paparazzi." "I wouldn't do that," Peyton replied calmly. She reached into her seat and pulled out a sleek, scarlet leather folio, the red file. She rested it on her lap like a weapon. "I have the RSVP confirmation right here on my phone. And as for dragging us out, look around, Eleanor. The senator is watching. Judge Harrison is watching. If your security touches a single hair on my head or on my children, I'll sue you for assault and battery in a courtroom I'll own by the time the verdict is read. I have the money to win now. Do you?" Eleanor faltered. Her gaze flickered to the scarlet folder, then to the guests, who were now shamelessly holding up their phones. A scene would be social suicide, but the presence of the boys was a slow-motion car crash she couldn't stop. "Who are they?" Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. She couldn't help it. The resemblance was an assault on her senses. The way Max tilted his head, the way Leo's brow furrowed, it was like looking at 3 ghosts of Dominic's childhood. "They're my dates," Peyton said simply. At that moment, Dominic arrived at the end of the aisle. He looked like a man walking toward a gallows. He stopped 3 feet away, his eyes locked on the triplets. Max, the boldest of the 3, looked up at Dominic. He tilted his head, a gesture so painfully identical to Dominic's own habit that a collective gasp went through the nearby pews. "Mommy," Max said, tugging Peyton's hand. "He looks like the man in the mirror." Dominic flinched as if he'd been physically struck. "Peyton," he croaked, his voice dry and devoid of the arrogance he had carried 4 years ago. "Peyton, tell me, are they?" "Are they what, Dominic?" Peyton challenged, her voice rising just enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Are they the children you didn't want?" "No, that's not right. You didn't even know about them because you were too busy moving your mistress into our bedroom before the ink was dry on the divorce papers." "Mistress? a woman in the second row whispered scandalously. The narrative Eleanor had spent years crafting, that Dominic and Vanessa had met long after the waitress left, was dissolving in real time. I didn't know, Dominic stammered. He looked at Leo, then Sam, then Max. He saw his own chin, his own brow, his own legacy staring back at him ×3. Tears welled in his ice-blue eyes. How old? 4, Peyton said. They turned 4 last week. Does the math work for you, Dominic, or do you need a calculator? Or perhaps your mother can explain how her settlement was supposed to cover the cost of 3 neonatal intensive care units. This is a trick, Eleanor interjected, stepping between Dominic and the boys. She grabbed Dominic's arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo. Don't be a fool, Dominic. She hired them. She went to a casting agency to find lookalikes just to ruin your reputation. She's a jealous, vindictive little gold digger. Grandma is scary, Sam whispered loudly to Leo. The crowd tittered. It was a small, sharp sound that pierced Eleanor's ego. She whipped her head around to glare at the child, but stopped. Sam was frowning, a specific brooding frown that Eleanor had seen on her own husband's face for 40 years. It was a genetic stamp that couldn't be faked, a signature written in bone and blood. We are starting, Eleanor snapped, realizing she was losing control of the room. Dominic, get to the altar. The music is starting. Peyton, if you make one sound, one single sound, I will destroy you. Peyton smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I don't need to make a sound, Eleanor. The truth is already screaming. The organ music swelled, the heavy, regal chords of the wedding march beginning to vibrate through the floor. Eleanor practically shoved Dominic toward the altar. He stumbled, looking back over his shoulder at the boys until he nearly tripped over the white orchid arrangements. He took his place at the altar, but his eyes weren't on the back of the tent where his bride was about to appear. He was staring at the front row. The doors to the estate manor opened, and Vanessa Banks stepped out. She was perfection, a custom Vera Wang creation of lace and tulle with a train that seemed to go on for miles. She held a bouquet of white orchids, her father, Senator Banks, looking proud as he offered her his arm. But as they began the long walk down the aisle, Vanessa noticed the atmosphere was wrong. Usually at a wedding, the guests smile and dab their eyes. But today, half the guests were craned in their seats, looking not at the bride, but at the woman in the emerald dress and the 3 little boys who looked like princes. Vanessa kept her smile plastered on, but her eyes darted to the side. Who is that? She wondered. And why is Dominic crying? She reached the altar. Dominic took her hand, but his palm was sweating profusely. He was trembling so hard the priest hesitated. You okay? Vanessa whispered through her teeth as the opening prayer began. Yeah, Dominic breathed, though he looked like he was about to vomit. The priest, an elderly bishop who had known the Sterling family for decades, droned on about sanctity and loyalty. The words rang hollow in the charged air. Then came the silence before the vows. The estate was quiet, save for the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. I'm hungry, Leo announced. It wasn't a scream. It was just the clear, bored statement of a 4-year-old in a silent room. Shh, Peyton said gently, handing him a cracker from her clutch. The crinkle of the wrapper sounded like a gunshot. Eleanor, sitting in the mother-of-the-groom's seat across the aisle, looked ready to explode. She signaled to a security guard standing in the shadows, making a sharp, cutting motion across her throat. Get them out. The guard began to move toward Peyton. Peyton saw him coming. She didn't flinch. She simply stood up. The movement caused the entire congregation to gasp. They thought she was objecting. Sit down, Eleanor hissed, forgetting to whisper. Peyton ignored her. She looked at the guard, raised a hand to stop him, and then looked directly at Dominic at the altar. Dominic, Peyton said. She didn't shout, but her voice carried with the authority of a boardroom executive. Your mother is sending a guard to remove your sons. Is that how you want to start your new marriage? By kicking your own flesh and blood out into the street again?" The priest stopped speaking. Vanessa dropped Dominic's hand. "Sons," Vanessa repeated, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She turned to Dominic. "Dominic, what is she talking about?" "It's a lie," Eleanor shrieked, jumping to her feet. "She's a liar. Security, remove her." "It's not a lie," a deep, authoritative voice boomed from the back of the tent. Everyone turned. Walking down the aisle, his silver hair catching the light, was Uncle Alistair. He was carrying a briefcase and a look of grim satisfaction. "I've run the DNA, Eleanor," Alistair said, walking toward the front. "And I think the senator would be very interested to know exactly whose blood is sitting in that front row." The escalation had reached its peak. The wedding was no longer a union, it was a crime scene. The silence that followed Uncle Alistair's declaration was so absolute it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the 300 guests huddled under the silk tent. Alistair Sterling didn't stop until he was standing directly between Peyton and the altar, his presence a jarring contrast of scientific coldness in a room heated by scandal. "Alistair, leave this instant," Eleanor hissed, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "You were excommunicated from this family for a reason. Your science has no place here." "My science is the only honest thing in this family, Eleanor," Alistair replied, his voice booming without effort. He turned to Dominic, who was trembling so violently that Vanessa had to let go of his arm to keep from being shaken. "Dominic, look at them. Really look at them." Peyton stood up, her emerald dress catching the light like a warning beacon. She touched Leo's chin, gently tilting his face toward the light. "Leo, sweetheart, look at your father." Leo, bored and slightly irritated by the adult drama, blinked his large, expressive eyes. In the bright afternoon sun filtering through the tent's silk canopy, the truth was undeniable. His left eye was a piercing, icy sterling blue, but in the lower quadrant of the iris there was a distinct, jagged fleck of gold. "Heterochromia iridum," Alistair announced to the crowd as if he were lecturing at a university. "A partial mutation, rare in the general population, but a genetic signature of the Sterling men for 4 generations. Dominic has it. His father had it. And as you can see, Leo, Sam, and Max all carry the mark." A ripple of whispers turned into a roar of hushed conversations. Guests in the back stood on chairs to see. The Sterling eye was a legend in their circles, a mark of pure blood that Eleanor had once bragged about. Now it was the brand of her betrayal. "It's a trick of the light," Eleanor shouted, her composure finally shattering. She lunged toward Leo, but the security guard Peyton had stopped earlier, stepped in Eleanor's way, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. He had seen the child's eyes. He knew who he was working for now. "The light isn't the only thing revealing the truth today, Eleanor," Peyton said, her voice cutting through the noise. She picked up the scarlet leather folio, the red file, and stepped toward the altar. Vanessa Banks, the woman who was supposed to be the new Mrs. Sterling, stood frozen. Her lace veil had snagged on a floral arrangement, pulling her head back at an awkward angle. She looked at Peyton, then at the boys, and finally at Dominic. "You knew," Vanessa whispered, her voice shrill with betrayal. "You knew she was pregnant when you left her." "I didn't," Dominic cried, falling to his knees on the velvet-covered steps of the altar. He reached out toward the boys, his hand hovering in the air. "Peyton, I swear, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Peyton said, her voice devoid of pity. "You were too busy letting your mother curate your life. But while you were playing Prince, Eleanor was playing with the books." Peyton opened the red file and pulled out a single sheet of paper, handing it not to Dominic but to Senator Banks, who had been watching the scene with growing fury. "What is this?" the senator growled, his face a dangerous shade of purple. "That," Peyton said, "is a summary of the Sterling estate's current debt-to-income ratio. It turns out the Sterling legacy is built on a foundation of second mortgages and defaulted loans. The merger with your family, Senator, wasn't a union of power, it was a bailout. Eleanor didn't choose Vanessa for her lineage. She chose her for your bank account. Senator Banks scanned the document, his eyes widening. He looked at Eleanor, who had gone the color of ash. "And if you flip to the second page," Peyton continued, her gaze never leaving Eleanor's, "you'll find a recorded transcript of a conversation between Mrs. Sterling and your Chief of Staff regarding a contribution to your re-election campaign in exchange for favorable zoning on the Hamptons cliffs. A bribe, Senator, one that I'm sure the Ethics Committee would love to discuss." You monster," Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "I'm not a monster, Eleanor," Peyton said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only those at the front could hear. "I'm just the waitress who learned how to keep a tab." Vanessa let out a strangled cry. She ripped the Vera Wang veil from her hair, the delicate lace tearing with a sound like a scream. "I can't do this. I am not being a footnote in a bankruptcy and a scandal." She turned and ran down the aisle, her massive silk train whipping behind her like a white flag of surrender. Her mother and father followed close behind, the senator pausing only to shove Dominic aside as he passed. Dominic stayed on his knees, his head bowed. The wedding was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The crowd was no longer pretending to be polite. Phones were out, recording the final collapse of the Sterling dynasty. Peyton looked down at Dominic. She felt a flicker of the old love she had once carried for him, a dim, distant warmth. But it was quickly extinguished by the cold reality of the 4 years she had spent struggling alone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver Patek Philippe pocket watch. She leaned down and placed it on the altar step next to him. "Your father's watch, Dominic," she said softly. "It's the only thing of yours I ever wanted. But I think you need to keep track of the time now. You've lost quite a bit of it." Peyton turned back to her sons. Leo, Sam and Max were standing by Chloe, watching the sad man on the floor. "Come on, boys," Peyton said, her voice returning to its warm, maternal strength. "The show is over. Let's go home." As she walked back down the aisle, the guests parted for her with a new kind of reverence. It wasn't the fearful respect they gave to Eleanor. It was the awe-struck recognition of a titan. Peyton didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs was the only applause she required. She reached the escalade, and as the door thudded shut, sealing her and her children in a soundproof, bullet-resistant sanctuary, she finally let out a long, shuddering breath. "Well?" Chloe asked from the front seat. Peyton looked at her sons, who were already arguing over who got the blue cup. She smiled, a genuine, tired and triumphant smile. "The foundation is gone," Peyton said. "Now we just wait for the walls to fall." The fallout was nuclear. By Monday morning, the Union of the Century had been rebranded by the press as the Sterling Slaughter. Tabloids featured grainy telephoto shots of the triplets in their velvet tuxedos alongside the headline, "Secret Heirs Crash Hamptons Wedding." The Sterling stock, already precarious, plummeted as investors realized the family's stability was a house of cards held together by a bribe that was now being investigated by the SEC. Peyton sat in her temporary office in Midtown Manhattan, the skyline of the city she had once fled in terror now spread out beneath her like a map of her own conquest. She wasn't watching the news, she was watching the digital ticker of a private acquisition. "They've served the papers," Chloe said, stepping into the room. She looked exhausted but triumphant. "Eleanor hired Blackwood and Associates. They're filing for emergency custody and a gag order. They're alleging malicious concealment and fraud." Peyton didn't look up from her monitor. "Blackwood is expensive. How is she paying for them?" "She isn't," Chloe replied with a sharp smile. "She's billing it to the Sterling Legacy Trust. or what's left of it. They want a deposition on Friday. They want to rattle you on their home turf." "Good," Peyton said, finally closing her laptop. "Tell the legal team to bring the red file. It's time to show Eleanor the difference between a legacy and an empire." Friday morning arrived with a biting chill. The conference room at Blackwood and Associates was designed to intimidate, all dark wood, leather chairs, and the heavy, oppressive scent of old money. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of taut skin and defiance. She was wearing a black suit that looked more like mourning attire, her hands trembling as she clutched a string of pearls. Dominic sat beside her, looking hollowed out. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, and his eyes were perpetually fixed on the floor. "Ms. O'Connor," began Mr. Thorne, Eleanor's lead attorney, a man with a smile like a viper and a voice like gravel. "You admit that you knowingly hid the existence of 3 sterling heirs for 4 years with the intent to emotionally distress my client." Peyton sat opposite them, wearing a white power suit that cost more than Thorne's car. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked directly at Eleanor. "I admit that I protected my children from a family with a documented history of emotional abuse," Peyton said, her voice a calm, steady rhythm. "Objection! Speculation!" Thorne barked. "It's not speculation, Mr. Thorne," Peyton countered. She slid the scarlet leather folio across the table. "Inside that folder, you'll find affidavits from 3 former Sterling nannies, including Mrs. Higgins, the woman who raised Dominic until Eleanor fired her for excessive affection. They all detail a pattern of locking children in dark rooms for discipline and using fear as a primary parenting tool." Dominic's head snapped up. "Mrs. Higgins, you found her." "She lives in a cottage in Maine, Dominic," Peyton said softly. "The house I bought for her 2 years ago when I found out Eleanor had denied her pension." Eleanor slammed her hand on the table. "This is a smear campaign. You are a waitress playing at being a CEO. You don't have the resources to fight a sterling custody battle. We will bleed you dry until you're back on your knees." Peyton let out a quiet, genuine laugh. It was the sound of a predator watching its prey jump into a trap. "Eleanor, you keep talking about the sterling resources. Have you checked your personal accounts this morning?" Thorne frowned, glancing at his client. "What is the meaning of this?" "I did my recon," Peyton said, leaning forward. "You wanted a war, Eleanor, so I investigated the terrain. The Sterling estate is leveraged to the hilt. You took out a second mortgage to pay for that wedding, the one that didn't happen. Your investments in offshore drilling? Tanked. You're cash poor and drowning in interest." Peyton pulled a final document from the red file, a banknote with a familiar gold seal. "I didn't just build a branding agency, Eleanor. I built an investment firm. And 3 hours ago I bought the primary mortgage note for the Sterling estate in the Hamptons from the bank that was about to foreclose on you. Technically, you are currently sitting in a room paid for by my company, and you are living in a house that belongs to me." The room went dead silent. Eleanor's jaw literally dropped. The pearls she was clutching snapped, the white spheres scattering across the mahogany table like tiny falling stars. You bought my house," Eleanor whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I bought the debt," Peyton corrected, "and as the owner of that debt, I'm willing to make a deal. You drop this custody suit with prejudice. You sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to approach my children or speak to the press again, and in exchange, I won't evict you." "Mother, sign it," Dominic said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. He stood up, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and disgust. "It's over. You tried to buy my sons and you ended up losing everything. Sign the papers." "Dominic, I did this for you," Eleanor shrieked. "No," Dominic said, walking toward the door. "You did it for a name that doesn't mean anything anymore." He turned to Peyton, his eyes searching hers. "I'll sign too. I'll drop any claim. I want to see them. Not as a sterling, just as a man." Peyton watched him. The resolution wasn't just about the money or the house, it was about the breaking of the spell. Dominic was finally seeing the rot in the foundation. "We'll talk about visitation, Dominic," Peyton said, her tone professional but no longer icy. "On my terms, in Seattle, under my supervision. If you can prove you're more than just your mother's shadow, maybe you can be their father." Eleanor sat broken at the table, her hands hovering over the legal documents. With a shaking hand, she picked up the pen. The waitress had just foreclosed on the dynasty. Peyton stood up and walked to the door, leaving the red file on the table as a reminder of the power she now held. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt the phantom weight of the silver Patek Philippe watch in her pocket. She realized she didn't need it anymore. The past was no longer a burden. It was a closed chapter. "Chloe," Peyton said as they walked toward the elevator, "call the movers. I want the Sterling family portraits out of that Hamptons house by Monday. We're turning the ballroom into a library for the boys." "And Eleanor?" Chloe asked. "She can stay in the guest wing," Peyton said, the elevator doors sliding open. "But tell the gardener to stop planting lavender. I want the smell of that house to change." The chapter ends with Peyton stepping out into the bright Manhattan sun, the sound of her heels on the pavement a steady, victorious drumbeat. The war was over. The healing was about to begin. A year later, the rain in Seattle was a soft, rhythmic drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Peyton's penthouse. It was a stark contrast to the sunny, manicured perfection of the Hamptons, a place that now felt like a distant, feverish dream. Peyton stood by the marble kitchen island, watching the elevator indicator light climb. Floor 30, floor 31. "Is he here yet?" Leo asked. He was sitting on the rug, lining up a fleet of toy cars in perfect chromatic order, a habit of precision he had definitely inherited from a grandfather he would never meet. "Yes, Leo, he's almost here," Peyton said, her voice steady. Her heart no longer hammered against her ribs at the thought of Dominic. The rage had evaporated, replaced by a cool, professional grace. The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and Dominic Sterling stepped out. He looked fundamentally different. The Tom Ford tuxedo was gone, replaced by a dark cashmere sweater and jeans that looked worn in. He carried 3 identical gift bags, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a camera or a mother's approval. He was looking at the floor, fumbling with his shoes. "Shoes off at the door, Dominic," Peyton said, crossing her arms. "We don't wear sterling loafers on the Moroccan wool." "Right, of course." Dominic placed his shoes neatly on the rack. He walked into the living room, stopping 5 feet from the boys. "Hi, guys," Dominic said, his voice cracking slightly. The triplets stood up. They were wearing matching dinosaur T-shirts. Max, the leader, stepped forward and studied Dominic's face with a piercing, blue-eyed intensity. "You're the man who ran on the grass," Max stated. Dominic flinched, but he didn't look away. "I am, but I'm also the man who's here to stay for lunch, if that's okay with you." For the next 2 hours, Peyton watched a surreal scene. The man who had been groomed to run corporations was sitting cross-legged on the floor, covered in glitter glue, trying to repair a plastic train engine while 3 hyperactive boys climbed over him. He was awkward. He used words that were too big for 4-year-olds, but he was trying. "Mommy says you're our dad," Sam whispered, peeking from behind a pillow, like the kings in the stories. Dominic looked up at Peyton, his eyes red-rimmed. "No, Sam. The kings were the ones who got it wrong. I'm just a guy who's learning how to build a bridge." Later, as the boys drifted into their afternoon nap, Dominic stood in the doorway of their room, watching the rise and fall of their chests. The silence of the penthouse was a living, breathing thing, peaceful rather than empty. "Eleanor is still in the guest wing," Dominic said softly, joining Peyton at the window. "She spends her days staring at the ocean, clutching that empty checkbook. She asks about them, Peyton. Every day." "She can ask," Peyton replied, her gaze fixed on the grey Pacific. But the answer remains the same. The boys will know their history, but they will not be raised by it. They are O'Connors. They are built on resilience, not inheritance. I told her I'm moving to Seattle, Dominic revealed. Permanently. I've taken a consulting job. It's a fraction of the old salary, but for the first time, I don't feel like a puppet. Peyton turned to him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver Patek Philippe pocket watch. It caught the soft Seattle light, the internal gears whirring with a timeless precision. I kept this because I wanted a piece of the man your father was, she said, placing the watch in Dominic's hand. But I realized I don't need a relic. I have the living, breathing proof of what's worth keeping. Dominic looked at the watch, then closed his hand over it. Thank you, Peyton, for not being like us, for being better. The sterling estate in the Hamptons still stood on the cliffs, but the white silk tents and the scent of lavender were gone. Now the grounds were filled with the sound of local school children. Peyton had turned the manor into the O'Connor Foundation for Early Literacy, converting the cold marble ballroom into a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves of books. On a quiet Tuesday, Peyton stood on the terrace where Eleanor had once stood with her glass of Sancerre. Peyton wasn't looking for flaws in the lawn or unworthy guests. She was looking at the horizon. Behind her, she heard the muffled laughter of Leo, Sam, and Max as they ran through the halls of the library, their footsteps echoing not with the weight of a dynasty, but with the lightness of a future they would choose for themselves. She thought of the girl she had been, the waitress who thought she was broken. She realized now that the Sterlings hadn't destroyed her. They had simply provided the forge. She had survived their coldness to find her own fire. The best revenge hadn't been the red file or the foreclosure. It hadn't been the scandal or the money. The best revenge was the quiet, absolute peace of knowing that she was whole, she was loved, and she was free. Peyton took a breath of the salt air, smiled at the sound of her son's voices, and walked back inside to join them. The empire was hers, but the home was theirs. Thank you for watching this journey of betrayal, resilience, and the ultimate victory of the heart. Peyton's story reminds us that while we cannot control the cruelty of others, we can always choose to build something beautiful from the ashes they leave behind. If you were moved by Sarah's transformation from a discarded shadow to a brilliant CEO and devoted mother, please like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more cinematic stories of justice and redemption. What would you have done in Peyton's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.